Imagine this, you're alone, the sun is scorching above, and your throat feels like sandpaper. You haven't eaten in days, and every sound in the darkness around you feels like it might be your last. The world thinks you're gone, but somehow, against all odds, you survive. Throughout history, there have been stories so unbelievable, so terrifying, and so inspiring that they almost sound like fiction. But every single one you're about to hear is 100%. These are the stories of ordinary men and women who stared death in the face and refused to give in. Take Aaron Ralston, for example. One moment he's hiking through the canyons of Utah. The next, his arm is trapped beneath an immovable boulder. For 6 long days, he battled hunger, thirst, and hopelessness, so he made a decision so shocking it would change his life forever. Or Julianne Kopke, a teenage girl who fell from the sky, literally. When her plane disintegrated above the Amazon rainforest, she plummeted nearly 2 miles into the jungle below. Against every odd, she survived the crash. But that was just the beginning of her nightmare. With broken bones, no supplies, and poisonous creatures all around her, she trekked for 11 days, clinging to life with nothing but sheer willpower. And then, the Andes flight disaster. A rugby team on their way to Chile crashes in the frozen wilderness of the mountains. No food, no warmth, no hope of rescue. For 72 excruciating days. The survivors had to make a choice. Most of us can't even imagine do the unthinkable or die. But survival doesn't always happen in the mountains. Sometimes it's on the open ocean, where the horizon stretches endlessly, and the only company is sharks circling beneath your fragile raft. Stephen Callahan drifted like that alone for 76 days, building tools out of scraps, spearing fish to survive, and staring at the stars as he wondered if he'd ever see land again. Or Hugh Glass, in the brutal wilderness of early America. Mauled by a grizzly bear, left for dead by his companions, he crawled more than 200 miles across unforgiving terrain, fueled by nothing but vengeance and the will to live. From frozen wastelands to blazing deserts, from shipwrecks to plane crashes, from explorers stranded in Antarctica to sailors adrift for months at sea. These survival stories aren't just about beating nature. They're about something deeper, the unbreakable strength of the human spirit. So grab your seat, because we're about to dive into the top 10 most incredible survival stories ever told. Each one more shocking, more gripping, and more inspiring than the last. And by the end, you'll be asking yourself one question: if it were me, would I have survived? Chapter 1, Trapped in Blue John Canyon. The Aaron Ralston story. The desert has a way of swallowing people whole. Endless stretches of red sandstone, silence broken only by the whisper of the wind, and canyons so narrow that sunlight struggles to reach the floor. It's a place both beautiful and merciless. And for Aaron Ralston, it became a tomb. At least, that's what it should have been. But this is not a story of a man who is buried in the desert. This is the story of a man who fought against death itself for 6 days with nothing but grit, pain, and an iron will to live. The adventurer. Aaron Ralston wasn't a rookie when it came to the wilderness. At 27 years old, he was a seasoned outdoorsman, an engineer turned adventurer who thrived on pushing his limits. He lived for the challenge: mountaineering, biking, hiking through the toughest terrains. Friends often described him as fearless, someone who craved isolation, who sought out the kind of silence only the wild could offer. But sometimes, fearlessness can look a lot like recklessness. On April 25, 2003, Aaron set out alone into the rugged canyons of southeastern Utah. He told no one exactly where he was going. No calls, no notes, no plan left behind. For Aaron, this wasn't unusual, it was freedom. But freedom has a price, and he was about to pay it. The moment everything changed. Blue John Canyon is not forgiving. It's a twisting labyrinth of narrow passages, sheer drops, and towering walls. Aaron moved with confidence, scaling rocks, sliding down crevices, enjoying the solitude. But then, as he descended a narrow slot canyon, disaster struck. A boulder weighing over 800 pounds shifted. In one split second, Aaron's right arm was crushed and pinned against the canyon wall. The impact reverberated through his bones. He screamed, he pushed, he pulled, but the rock wouldn't move. And just like that, Aaron was trapped. The first hours. At first, he was optimistic. He had water, some food, a multi-tool, a flashlight, and the kind of determination that had gotten him through countless climbs before. Surely someone would come by. Surely he'd find a way out. But hours turned into a full day, and no one came. The truth gnawed at him. No one knew he was here. No rescue team was coming. The desert sun scorched the canyon by day, and the cold gnawed at his body by night. He rationed his sips of water, nibbled at the scraps of food he had. He tried everything, pulling, chipping away at the rock with his dull knife, rigging pulleys from his climbing ropes. Nothing worked. The boulder was his prison, and the canyon his cell. The spiral into desperation. By the third day, reality hit him harder than the rock itself. His water was almost gone. His body was weakening. He began recording messages on his video camera, leaving behind final words for his family. "Mom, Dad, I love you." His voice cracked as he spoke to the lens, fully believing these tapes would be his last legacy. Hallucinations came next. Visions of friends, family, even strangers appeared in the shimmering heat. At one point, he imagined himself floating above the canyon, free at last. But every time, he opened his eyes and saw the same truth. His arm was still trapped. Death wasn't creeping closer, was already there, sitting beside him, waiting for him to close his eyes. The decision, on the fifth night, delirious and half-dead, Aaron had a vision. He saw himself holding a childless son he didn't yet have. And in that moment, he realized he wasn't ready to die. There was still life ahead, if only he could break free. But there was only one way. He couldn't move the rock. He couldn't chip through it. But he could cut off what the rock had claimed. The thought was horrifying. He had tried before, using the small blade on his multi-tool, but the knife was too dull to cut through bone. It was impossible, so he thought. That night, with a kind of clarity that only desperation brings, he realized something. He didn't need to cut through bone. He could break it. 127 hours. On the morning of May 1st, after nearly 6 days, 127 hours trapped, Aaron began the most excruciating act of self-liberation in survival history. He positioned his trapped arm, braced himself, and used the leverage of his body to snap the bones in his forearm. The sound echoed in the canyon, sharp, sickening, final. Pain shot through his body, but pain was life, and life meant hope. Then came the cutting. With his dull knife, he sawed through flesh, muscle, and tendons. The process was brutal, the pain unimaginable, but Aaron pushed through, driven by the singular thought: freedom. When he severed the last strand of tissue, he stumbled back, gasping. He was free, but he was also bleeding to death. The escape. Adrenaline surged as he wrapped a crude tourniquet around his stump. Then, in a state of near shock, he rappelled down a 65-foot cliff one-handed. Staggering through the desert, dehydrated and weak, he finally encountered a family of hikers. Their gasp at his condition was followed by frantic action: water, help, a helicopter rescue. Aaron Ralston had beaten the desert. He had beaten the boulder. And most of all, he had beaten death. The aftermath. Ralston's story spread like wildfire. His memoir, Between a Rock and a Hard Place, became a bestseller, and later, the film 127 Hours brought his ordeal to the big screen. But more than fame, Aaron's survival became a symbol of the unbreakable human will. He lost an arm, but he gained a life worth living when he had almost given up. To this day, he continues to climb, to explore, and to inspire countless others with his story. When people ask him how he survived, his answer is simple: I didn't lose my hand. I gained my freedom. Closing reflection. Aaron Ralston's survival wasn't just about cutting off his arm. It was about cutting off the part of him that was ready to surrender. It was about finding, in the darkest canyon of his life, a spark that said, "Keep going." And if there's one lesson his story leaves us with, it's this: when all hope is gone, sometimes the only way out is through unimaginable sacrifice. Chapter 2. The Girl Who Fell from the Sky. Julianne Cope's survival in the Amazon. The jungle is alive. It hums, it breathes, it devours. The Amazon is a kingdom where life and death are in constant battle, where predators lurk in every shadow, and survival is a daily fight even for creatures built to endure it. For humans, it's hell. But imagine being 17 years old, alone, injured, and dropped into that world with no supplies, no help, and no hope. This is the story of Julianne Cope, the girl who fell from the sky literally and somehow walked out of the Amazon alive. The flight that shouldn't have gone. Wrong. It was Christmas Eve, 1971. Flight 508 of Lanza Airlines lifted off from Lima, Peru, heading toward the city of Pucallpa. On board were 92 people, families, couples, travelers, heading home for the holidays. Among them was 17-year-old Julianne Cope and her mother, Maria. Julianne wasn't just any teenager. She was the daughter of two German zoologists who had spent years working in Peru, studying the creatures of the jungle. She knew about snakes, insects, and the dangers that hid in the rainforest. Still, she was just a girl, excited to spend Christmas with her father at a research station deep in the Amazon. But fate had other plans. The crash. The flight was smooth for the first half. Julianne leaned against the window, staring at the blanket of clouds below. But then, turbulence. Violent shakes rattled the plane. Passengers clutched their seats. Lightning lit up the sky. And then came the sound. A thunderous explosion ripped through the cabin as lightning struck one of the engines. Flames erupted. The plane broke apart midair, swallowed by a storm. In those moments of chaos, Julianne felt herself sucked out of the fuselage, still strapped into her seat. Falling, spinning, plummeting through the sky. Below her stretched nothing but endless green. The Amazon rainforest, imagine it, falling almost 2 miles through the air, knowing death is certain. But then blackness, the awakening. When Julianne opened her eyes, she was lying beneath the canopy of the jungle. Her seat had cushioned the fall, bouncing through branches that slowed her descent. Against every law of physics and every shred of probability, she was alive. But she wasn't unscathed. Her collarbone was broken. One eye was swollen shut. She had deep gashes across her legs and arms. Her head throbbed with a concussion. She called for her mother, screamed until her voice cracked, but the jungle swallowed her cries. She was alone. The first horrors. Julianne had no food, no gear, and no sense of where she was. Around her, the jungle buzzed with life. Insects swarmed. Mosquitoes feasted on her exposed skin, and the cries of unseen predators echoed through the darkness. But Julianne remembered what her parents had taught her. She knew she had to move. She knew water meant life. So she began to search for a stream. For hours, she stumbled, dizzy, bleeding, and weak. Finally, she found a small creek. Her training kicked in. Creeks lead to rivers, and rivers lead to people. If she followed the water, she might live. The march through the jungle. For 11 days, Julianne fought her way through the Amazon. Every step was agony. She had lost one shoe during the fall, so she walked barefoot, feeling the sting of thorns and sharp rocks. At night, she shivered in the damp air, tormented by mosquitoes. Insects laid eggs in her wounds, and she could see maggots writhing in her skin. Once, she stumbled upon a group of vultures circling in the distance. Following them, she found the wreckage of the plane and the bodies of passengers. The smell was overwhelming, the sight unforgettable. She turned away, determined not to become one of them. Julianne survived by sipping water straight from the creek and nibbling on candy she had scavenged from the crash. Hunger clawed at her stomach, weakness gnawed at her strength, but still she walked. She pushed on, step by step, day after day, driven by something greater than survival alone, the faint hope of finding her father again. The lowest point. By the 10th day, Julianne was delirious. Her wounds were infected. She could barely see, barely walk. She collapsed by the riverbank, sure that death had finally found her. But fate wasn't done with her yet. Through the haze of her failing vision, she spotted something unnatural, a small wooden boat tied to the bank. Nearby, she saw a hut. People had been here. Civilization-salvation was within reach. The rescue? A tea. Julianne crawled to the hut and waited. Hours passed. Finally, local lumber workers returned. At first, they were shocked to pale, bloodied girl emerging from the jungle like a ghost. But when Julianne spoke, weakly, in Spanish, they realized she was real. The men cleaned her wounds, poured gasoline into the cuts to kill the maggots, and gave her food and water. The next day, they took her downriver in their boat, eventually reaching a village with radio communication. From there, word spread quickly. Julianne Kopke had survived what no one else did. Aftermath. Of the 92 passengers on Flight 508, Julianne was the sole survivor. Rescuers eventually found her mother's body near the crash site. Julianne's survival became a sensation across the world, not only because of the fall, but because of her unimaginable endurance in the jungle. She later went on to study biology, following in her parents' footsteps. And today, she works as a zoologist, dedicating her life to the very wilderness that nearly killed her. Her story was told in the documentary Wings of Hope and continues to inspire millions. Closing reflection. Julianne's survival wasn't just about luck, though luck played a part. It was about knowledge, resilience, and the quiet courage of a 17-year-old girl who refused to give up. Most people would have surrendered to the jungle. Most would have collapsed and never risen again. But Julianne kept moving forward, step by painful step, until she found life again. Her story leaves us with a haunting thought. Sometimes survival doesn't come from strength, but from the simple refusal to stop walking, no matter how broken you are. Julianne Kopke didn't just fall from the sky, she rose from the jungle. Proof that even in the darkest wilderness, hope can still take root. Chapter 3 to 72 Days in the Mountains. The Andes Flight Disaster. The mountains are merciless. Their beauty hides danger. Their silence masks death. And when an aircraft carrying 45 souls fell from the sky into the frozen jaws of the Andes in 1972, what followed became one of the most harrowing survival stories in human history. This is the story of men who stared starvation in the face, who endured cold so bitter it turned their bones to eye sand, who made a choice so unthinkable that the world recoiled in horror. Yet without it, none of them would have lived. The crash, October 13, 1972. A chartered Uruguayan Air Force plane carrying a rugby team. Their friends and family took off from Montevideo, bound for Santiago, Chile. Spirits were high, laughter music, the banter of young athletes looking forward to their match. But as the plane entered the Andes, clouds thickened, winds howled, and navigation became uncertain. The pilot, thinking they had already crossed the mountains, began to descend. He was wrong. Moments later, the aircraft slammed into a ridge. Metal screamed as wings tore away, seats ripped from the floor, and passengers were thrown like rag dolls. When the wreckage skidded to a stop, the once lively plane was now a mangled coffin, perched at nearly 12,000 feet. Out of 45 passengers, 29 survived the crash. Some were gravely injured, trapped in pain with no way out. The survivors pulled the dead aside, tended to the wounded, and looked around at their new home, a barren, snow-covered wasteland where nothing lived. The first day minus 76 days adrift. Stephen Callahan's ordeal at sea. The ocean is endless. A world of silence broken only by the crash of waves, where the horizon stretches into infinity. For sailors, it's a place of beauty, but also a place of terror. Because when something goes wrong out there, you're not just lost, you're forgotten. This is the story of Stephen Callahan, a man who faced the wrath of the Atlantic Ocean armed with nothing but a tiny life raft, his wits, and a stubborn will to survive. For 76 days, he drifted alone, a speck on the water, surrounded by sharks, storms, and despair. The dream that became a nightmare. Stephen Callahan was no stranger to the sea. A naval architect and seasoned sailor, he lived for the ocean. In 1981, chasing adventure, he built his own small yacht, the Napoleon Solo, and set sail across the Atlantic, bound for the Caribbean. At first, the voyage was everything he had dreamed of. Clear skies, rolling waves, the intoxicating freedom of open water. But in February of 1982, while sailing alone off the Canary Islands, fate turned against him. In the dead of night, a storm struck. Waves towered over his small vessel. Winds screamed like BANSHEES, then dash disaster. Something slammed into the yacht's hull. Callahan never knew if it was a whale or just the fury of the sea, but within minutes, water poured in. His beloved boat was sinking. Into the raft. With seconds to spare, Callahan grabbed what supplies he could: some food rations, water, tools, a spear gun, and clambered into his inflatable life raft as the Napoleon Solo disappeared beneath the waves. Now, instead of a sturdy yacht, he had a fragile rubber raft, 7 feet long, barely enough room to stretch out. And beyond that raft, 1,800 miles of open Atlantic. The first days. At first, Callahan thought rescue might come quickly. Shipping lanes weren't far, and surely someone had seen his distress flares. But as the days dragged on, no ships appeared. No planes, nothing but endless blue. His supplies dwindled fast. The meager water bottles and food packets couldn't last. Hunger twisted his gut. Thirst burned his throat, and the salt air cracked his skin. But Stephen Callahan wasn't ready to die. He was an engineer, a problem solver. If the ocean wanted a fight, it had one. Fighting the ocean, Callahan fashioned tools from scraps, building a makeshift solar still to distill seawater. He rigged fishing lines from his gear and began catching mahi-mahi and flying fish, which became his main source of food. But every victory came with a price. Saltwater sores covered his skin. His eyes burned from the glare of the sun. Sharks circled his raft, bumping it, testing its strength. He knew that one wrong move, one puncture on the ocean, would swallow him whole. Nights were the worst. Darkness stretched in every direction. The stars, his only company. His mind wandered. Hallucinations blurred reality, and loneliness pressed down like a weight heavier than the sea itself. The storms. On more than one occasion, Callahan's fragile raft was battered by violent storms. Waves rose higher than houses, tossing him like a toy. He clung to the raft's ropes, praying it wouldn't tear apart. The ocean wasn't just starving him. It was trying to drown him. But with every storm survived, his determination hardened. "I refuse to be forgotten," he wrote later. And somehow, through ingenuity and sheer will, he kept the raft afloat. The long drift. Weeks turned into months. His beard grew wild, his body shrank from hunger, and still he drifted westward. He learned to live as part of the sea, reading the movements of fish, patching his raft when sharks bit into it, finding small joys in the rhythm of survival. Once a ship passed close, so close he could see the people on deck. He fired his flares, waved frantically, screamed until his voice broke. But no one noticed. The ship vanished into the horizon, leaving him in despair. For hours he wept, ready to surrender. but then he pulled himself together. If no one would save him, he would save himself. Land in sight. On day 76, after drifting more than 1,800 miles, Callahan spotted something different on the horizon. Birds circling. The water around him changed color. And then land, the Caribbean, weak, skeletal, and barely able to move. Callahan's raft finally drifted into the view of fishermen near the island of Marigalante, just off Guadeloupe. Shocked at the ghostly figure before them, the fishermen hauled him aboard. He had lost nearly a third of his body weight, covered in sores and burns, but he was alive. Aftermath: Stephen Callahan's ordeal became legendary. His memoir, Adrift, 76 Days Lost at Sea, inspired millions and became a classic of survival literature. Decades later, his expertise even contributed to the filming of Life of Pi, where he advised on the realism of life raft survival. But Callahan himself described the experience not just as survival, but as a strange kind of communion with the sea. "I was a speck in the universe," he wrote, "but I learned how to endure." Closing reflection. Callahan's survival wasn't luck, it was the perfect storm of knowledge, resilience, and sheer refusal to quit. Alone in the Atlantic, he learned to think like the ocean, to live by its rules, and to bend without breaking. His story forces us to ask, what would we do, lost at sea, with nothing but a fragile raft between us and eternity? Would we despair? Would we fight? For Stephen Callahan, the answer was clear. And because of that, his name will forever be etched into the annals of survival as the man who drifted across the Atlantic for 76 days and lived to tell the tale. Chapter 5: Touching the Void. A desperate climb for life. The high Andes are a world apart. Jagged peaks tear into the clouds, glaciers glisten like glass, and the air is so thin that every breath feels like a battle. To mountaineers, these heights are sacred where glory lives side by side with death. In 1985, two young British climbers, Joe Simpson and Simon Yates, ventured into this frozen kingdom to climb an unclimbed route up the west face of Ciula Grande, a 21,000-foot giant in the Peruvian Andes. What began as a dream ascent soon spiraled into one of the most dramatic survival stories in mountaineering history, a tale of trust, betrayal, endurance, and the thin line between life and death. The Summit Dream. Joe and Simon were not famous climbers. They were young, hungry for challenge, chasing climbs that others thought impossible. The west face of Ciula Grande was considered suicidal: steep ice walls, unstable snow, and savage storms. But that's what drew them in. After days of grueling climbing, frostbitten fingers clawing at ice, lungs screaming for air, they achieved the impossible. They stood on the summit, just as specks against the vast white sky. For a moment, they felt invincible. But in mountaineering, the summit is only half the journey. The descent kills more climbers than the climb itself. And Joe and Simon were about to learn why. The fall, on the way down, disaster struck. Joe slipped and crashed, shattering his right leg. The bone drove through his knee joint, catastrophic injury in the middle of a 21,000-foot peak. Alone, it was a death sentence. But Simon refused to abandon his friend. For hours, he lowered Joe down the mountain on their rope, 300 feet at a time. It was slow, brutal work, but it was their only chance. As night fell, a blizzard descended, and visibility vanished. Simon lowered Joe again, only this time. Something went wrong. Joe dangled helplessly over a cliff edge, hanging in midair, unable to climb back up. The rope tightened. Simon braced himself, the full weight of his injured partner pulling him down the slope. He couldn't see Joe. He couldn't hear him. Snow blinded his eyes. Exhaustion drained his strength. Minutes stretched into eternity. Simon was slipping. If he held on, they'd both die. If he cut the rope, Joe would fall, but Simon might live. A lonely storm. Simon made the most agonizing decision of his life. He pulled out his knife and cut the rope. Joe plummeted into the abyss, crashing into the glacier below. Simon believed his friend was dead. Guilt-ridden but desperate, he stumbled down the mountain alone. But Joe wasn't dead. By some miracle, the fall had dropped him into a deep crevasse, frozen tomb. His body was broken, his leg useless, but he was alive. The crevasse. Joe lay in the blackness, listening to the ice groan around him. Every second felt like the glacier would crush him. He could have waited for death. No one would blame him. But something inside refused to quit. With agonizing effort, he lowered himself deeper into the crevasse, searching for an exit. At last, through the gloom, he saw a sliver of light way out. He crawled toward it, dragging his ruined leg behind him until he spilled onto the glacier floor outside. Now, the real ordeal began. The crawl. Miles of jagged ice and rock stretched between Joe and base camp. He had no food, no water, and no way to walk. For 3 days, he crawled, inch by inch, across the glacier. His shattered leg tore against the ice. The sun burned by day, the cold froze him by night. Hallucinations plagued him. His body screamed for rest, but his mind whispered, "Just one more crawl, one more push." He sang songs in his head to keep himself moving, a desperate rhythm to drown out the pain. At one point, he fell into another crevasse. Lying there, broken, he nearly gave up. But the will to live drove him onward. He clawed his way back out, refusing to let the mountain claim him. The camp? By the 4th day, Joe was a ghost of himself, starving, delirious, half dead. But as he crawled through the rocks, he heard something faint. Voices. Simon and another climber were at base camp, preparing to leave. Joe screamed, his voice ragged and weak. At first, they thought it was the wind. Then they heard it again. Against all odds, Joe had crawled back to camp. Simon was stunned. He had believed he'd condemned his friend to death. Now Joe was alive, clinging to life by sheer willpower. Together, they nursed him back down the mountain, step by painful step. Aftermath? Both men survived, but their story sparked fierce debate. Many condemned Simon for cutting the rope, calling it betrayal. Others defended him, saying he had no choice, that he saved both their lives by acting. Joe himself never blamed Simon. In fact, he wrote about his gratitude. "Had he not cut the rope, we'd both be dead," Joe later said. Their bond, though tested by the mountain, endured. Joe Simpson's book, Touching the Void, became a mountaineering classic. Later, it was turned into a documentary so raw and powerful that audiences wept in theaters. Closing reflection. The story of Joe Simpson and Simon Yates isn't just about survival. It's about the unbearable weight of choice, the cruelty of nature, and the resilience of the human spirit. At 21,000 feet, where the air itself is hostile, Joe refused to surrender. Crawling through ice and agony, he became living proof that survival is less about strength than it is about will. When the void opens beneath us, whether it's a mountain crevasse or the struggles of life, we all face the same question Joe did. Do we give in to the darkness, or do we crawl toward the light? Joe chose the light, and because of that, his story will echo forever in the world of survival legends. Chapter 6. Hugh Glass. The Revenant's True Story. The American frontier was a land of raw wilderness. Endless forests, roaring rivers, and plains swarming with buffalo, but also prowling wolves. Hostile tribes and predators that ruled the wild. To survive here, men needed strength, cunning, and the grit to stare death in the face. In 1823, one man did just that. His name was Hugh Glass. A trapper, frontiersman, and adventurer. Glass would endure one of the most astonishing survival ordeals in American history. Mauled by a grizzly bear, abandoned by his companions, and left for dead, Glass clawed his way back to life alone, unarmed and driven by revenge. The expedition. The story begins with General William Ashley's fur trading expedition. Glass, already known as a skilled trapper, joined the team of rugged mountain men who sought fortune in the uncharted lands of the upper Missouri River. The frontier was unforgiving. Native American tribes defended their lands. Wild animals stalked the woods, and weather could kill as surely as any blade. But these men weren't easily frightened. They were explorers, chasing profit and glory. For Hugh Glass, this was the life he knew. A man in his early 40s, toughened by years in the wilderness, he carried no illusions about its dangers. But nothing could prepare him for what came next. The grisly attack. It was a clear morning when Glass left camp to scout ahead for food. He moved quietly through the underbrush, scanning for game. Then he heard the low growl of a mother grizzly bear. Before he could reach for his rifle, the bear charged. She was massive, claws like knives, jaws powerful enough to snap bones. Glass fought back with everything he had, firing a desperate shot, plunging his knife into her fur, grappling in a frenzy of blood and fury. But the bear tore into him, ripping flesh from his back, crushing his ribs, tearing open his throat. When the others finally reached him, the grizzly lay dead, but so nearly did Hugh Glass. His body was shredded, his scalp was half torn away, his throat punctured, his leg broken. Every breath rattled like the last. To the men of the expedition, he was as good as gone. Abandoned. General Ashley faced a grim choice. They couldn't carry a dying man through hostile territory, not with native. War parties nearby and miles of wilderness to cover. To ease his passing, Ashley assigned to volunteers John Fitzgerald and a teenager named Jim Bridger to stay with Glass until he died, then bury him properly. But Glass refused to die. Day after day, he clung stubbornly to life, wheezing through his wounds, eyes flickering with a will no injury could extinguish. Fitzgerald grew restless. The danger was too great. At last, convinced Glass would never survive, Fitzgerald and Bridger abandoned him. They took his rifle, his knife, his supplies, everything. They left him alone in the wilderness, broken and unarmed. And yet, Hugh Glass lived. The crawl. No food. No weapons, no allies. A shattered body crawling with maggots. Glass should have been a corpse. Instead, he became a legend. Using only his hands and elbows, he began dragging himself across the wilderness. Every inch was agony. His wounds oozed, his leg useless, his back torn raw. He survived by eating berries, roots, and even insects. At one point, he lay his body in the sun to let maggots clean the rotting flesh from his wounds. Grim medicine, but it kept infection at bay. Day after day, he crawled, fueled by one burning thought: revenge. Fitzgerald and Bridger had left him to die, and he swore he would make them pay. The long journey. Glass crawled for weeks until he reached the Cheyenne River, where he found a miracle. Friendly Native Americans who gave him food and stitched his wounds with buffalo hide. Their aid kept him alive, but the journey was far from over. Glass floated down rivers on makeshift rafts, stumbled through forests, and limped across plains. Covering more than 200 miles in his quest for survival. His determination shocked everyone who encountered him. He was no longer just a man, he was a revenant, a figure returned from the grave, unyielding in his pursuit of life. Confrontation. Months later, Hugh Glass staggered into Fort Kiowa, gaunt and scarred, but alive. The men stared in disbelief. The ghosts they'd left behind had returned. Glass's fury burned brightest for John Fitzgerald, the man who had stolen his rifle and abandoned him. He tracked Fitzgerald down, ready for vengeance. But when the moment came, Glass made a choice that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of killing Fitzgerald, he spared him. Some accounts say it was because Fitzgerald had joined the U.S. Army, making him untouchable. Others say Glass, hardened by suffering, realized that revenge would not heal him. Whatever the reason, he let Fitzgerald live. As for Jim Bridger, the teenager who had followed Fitzgerald's lead, Glass forgave him outright. He was young, inexperienced, and had only done what he thought necessary. Aftermath. Hugh Glass lived on to continue trapping and exploring. His story spread across the frontier, passed from campfire to campfire, growing into legend. Writers of the time painted him as a symbol of frontier toughness, a man too stubborn to die. Nearly 200 years later, his tale would inspire books, songs, and the Oscar-winning film The Revenant. But the reality was harsher than any movie could show. Glass didn't survive through cinematic heroism, he survived through grit, pain, and the refusal to surrender, no matter the odds. Closing reflection, Wilderness tried to kill him. The grizzly tried to tear him apart. His companions abandoned him. But Hugh Glass proved that survival is not always about strength, it is about will. His crawl across the American wilderness remains one of the most astonishing feats of human endurance. It reminds us that even when stripped of everything's food, weapons, even dignity, a person can still cling to life with nothing but raw determination. Hugh Glass became more than a man. He became a legend, the revenant who refused to stay dead. Chapter 7. Douglas Mawson, Alone in Antarctica. Antarctica is a land that does not forgive, a continent of endless white, where winds howl at 200 miles per hour, where the cold gnaws at flesh until it turns black, and where the landscape itself seems designed to erase human life. In 1912, Douglas Mawson, an Australian explorer, led an expedition into this frozen hell. What followed became one of the greatest survival stories ever told. A tale of tragedy, hunger, and a man who walked the edge of death, utterly alone, across one of the harshest landscapes on Earth, the heroic age. The early 20th century was the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. Men like Scott Amundsen and Shackleton fought to map the last blank spaces on the globe. Mawson, a geologist and scientist, wasn't chasing glory, he wanted knowledge. But Antarctica doesn't care about motives. In December 1912, Mawson set out with two companions, Xavier Mertz and Belgrave Ninas, on a sledging journey deep into the interior of the continent. Their goal, gather scientific data, map uncharted territory, and return to base camp in a few weeks. They had 3 sledges, 16 dogs, and enough supplies, at least. That's what they believed. The crevasse. The first weeks went smoothly, but then came disaster. As they crossed a glacier, Ninas's sled broke through a hidden crevasse. In an instant, Nina's 6 dogs, most of their food, and their tent vanished into the abyss. Mawson and Mertz leaned over the edge, calling his name, but there was only silence. Ninas was gone. The loss was catastrophic. With him went nearly all their supplies. Now, stranded 300 miles from Bass, the 2 remaining men had almost nothing. 1 sled, a few scraps of food, and a continent that wanted them dead. The hunger. Mawson and Mertz turned back, dragging their sled across endless white wastelands. Soon, their rations ran out. Desperation drove them to eat their dogs, one by one. But this was no salvation. The dogs' livers contained toxic levels of vitamin A. Mertz grew violently, ill, his skin peeled. His hair fell out, his stomach twisted with agony. Day by day, he grew weaker, until at last, he died in the snow, leaving Mawson utterly alone. Alone in the white. Imagine it. 300 miles of ice ahead, no food, no shelter, but a thin canvas tent, and no living soul within hundreds of miles. Mawson buried Mertz as best he could, then pressed on alone. His skin cracked and bled. His hair fell out in clumps. The soles of his feet separated from the flesh. hanging like loose socks inside his boots. Every step was agony. Sometimes he tied his feet with string to hold the skin together. Sometimes he fell into hidden crevasses, saved only because his sledge caught on the edges. More than once, he dangled over bottomless black pits, dragging himself out with frozen hands. The journal. Through it all, Mawson kept a journal. His words captured the torment. The situation is serious. I have lost my companion. I am alone. Death stares me in the face. Yet he refused to stop. Each morning, he forced himself to rise, eat a few frozen scraps, and march forward into the white void. He measured distances, plotted his position, and clung to the thought of reaching base camp, the ice cave. At one point, Mawson stumbled into yet another crevasse. This time, he fell 60 feet. His rope stopped him from plunging further, but he was trapped, dangling above the darkness. Slowly, inch by inch, he hauled himself up the rope. His hands bled, his body shook, but somehow, impossibly, he climbed back to the surface. When he crawled out, he collapsed in the snow, too weak to move, whispering, "I am not destined to die here. I must go on." The long march. For weeks, Mawson trudged across the ice, averaging only a few miles a day. His skin was yellowed, his body skeletal. He hallucinated, seeing companions who weren't there, hearing voices in the wind. At last, after a march of more than 100 miles alone, he spotted something on the horizon, a small wooden hut. His base camp, but fate wasn't done with him yet. The ship that left, when Mawson staggered into camp, he was too late. The expedition's supply ship, the Aurora, had departed just hours earlier, believing him dead. Exhausted beyond words, Mawson collapsed. He would have to wait nearly another year in Antarctica for the ship's return. The return. In December 1913, more than a year after his nightmare began, Douglas Mawson finally sailed home. He was gaunt, scarred, and aged far beyond his years. But he was alive. The world hailed him as a hero. His survival was described as the greatest story of lone survival in polar exploration. Scientists celebrated the data he had brought back. But to Mawson himself, it was no triumph only, a reminder of how close he had come to death. Closing reflection. Mawson's story is different from most survival tales. There was no rescue, no last-minute salvation. There was only a man, shattered and starving, who decided every single day that he would not stop walking. In Antarctica, where the land itself seems to conspire against life, he endured. Alone, he proved that survival isn't about strength or weapons, it's about willpower, discipline, and the refusal to surrender, even when surrender would be easier. Douglas Mawson didn't just survive Antarctica, he defied it. And his footsteps across that white wasteland echo still, a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. Chapter 8, Poon Lim, 133 days on a raft. The sea is vast, merciless, and patient. For those who fall into its grasp, it is both captor and executioner. Yet in 1942, during the height of World War II, one-man ordinary seaman named Poon Lim defied the Atlantic Ocean in a struggle that lasted 133 days, longer than almost anyone in recorded history. This is the story of a man who refused to drown, starve, or surrender, even as the sea tried everything to claim him. The torpedo. Poon Lim was a Chinese sailor working aboard the British merchant ship SS Ben Lomond, which sailed the Atlantic carrying wartime supplies. On November 23, 1942, while 750 miles off the coast of Brazil, a German U-boat struck. A torpedo ripped through the ship's hull. Within minutes, the Ben Lomond was sinking. Of the 55 men aboard, nearly all went down with her. Only Poon Lim, tossed into the chaos, managed to find a lifeline. A wooden life raft bobbing amid the wreckage. Clinging to it, soaked and alone, he began the longest ordeal of his life. The raft. The raft was a square wooden platform, about 8 feet across, with a small canvas roof for shade. On board were a few tins of biscuits, some water, a flashlight, and a few survival essentials. Barely enough to last weeks, certainly not months. At first, Poon Lim rationed carefully, sipping water, nibbling biscuits. But soon, the supplies dwindled. He was adrift on the open sea, the sun baking by day, the cold gnawing by night. The ocean stretched in every direction, empty, endless. Hunger and ingenuity. Poon Lim had two choices: starve or fight. He chose to fight. Using wires from the raft, he fashioned a crude fishing line. With it, he caught small fish, which he ate raw. But he didn't stop there. He also captured seabirds that landed on the raft, twisting their necks and drinking their blood to quench his thirst. Their flesh gave him strength. Their bones he fashioned into hooks for more fishing. He became part of the raft hunter, butcher, fisherman, scavenger. Every scrap of material was turned into a tool for survival. The sharks. But the ocean is never without danger. Sharks began circling the raft, drawn by the scent of blood from his catches. They snapped at his hands, rammed the raft, tested the wood. One day, desperate for food, Poon Lim baited a hook with bird flesh. A shark took it. A savage battle followed. Poon Lim hauled the beast aboard, bludgeoning it with a water jug until it lay still. Then he sliced it open, drank its blood, and ate its liver raw. In that moment, he proved that he would not be prey, he would be predator. The passing ships, perhaps the cruelest torment was not the hunger nor the sharks, but hope. Several times, ships passed within sight. Once an American vessel steamed close. Poon Lim waved frantically, signaling with his flashlight. But the ship did not stop. Perhaps they feared a U-boat trap. Another time, a German U-boat surfaced nearby. The sailors even saw him but ignored him, letting him drift. Each time, despair threatened to overwhelm him. But each time, he pulled himself back. If I must live on this raft forever, he thought, I will. The endless drift. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Poon Lim grew thin, his hair matted, his skin cracked by salt and sun. Yet, he adapted. He learned to catch rainwater in canvas, to dry fish in the sun for later, to turn survival into routine. In the silence of the ocean, he spoke to himself, sang songs, replayed memories. Loneliness clawed at his mind, but he refused to let madness in. The rescue. At last, after 133 days adrift, land appeared on the horizon. Poon Lim had drifted thousands of miles from the South Atlantic all the way to Brazil. Fishermen spotted his raft, staring in disbelief at the half-dead man who had become a creature of the sea. They pulled him aboard, weak but alive. He had lost weight, his body scarred by sun and salt, but his spirit was unbroken. The aftermath? Poon Lim's survival shocked the world. He had endured longer at sea than almost anyone in recorded history. When he recovered, he was hailed as a hero, receiving the British Empire Medal from King George VI. After the war, he emigrated to the United States, where he lived quietly, carrying with him the memory of the ocean's trial. Most survival stories last days or weeks. Poon Lim lasted months alone, drifting across an ocean that swallows men without thought. He survived not because he was stronger, but because he was clever, resourceful, and unwilling to give up. He turned a scrap of wood into a fortress, scraps of bone into tools, and even predators into prey. The Atlantic tested him with fire, hunger, loneliness, and despair. Yet he emerged alive, carrying a story that reminds us of the unbreakable human will. Poon Lim's raft was small. The ocean was endless. But for 133 days, one man proved that even the vast Atlantic could not drown determination. Chapter 9. Ernest Shackleton. The Endurance Expedition. The year was 1914. The world was teetering on the brink of the Great War. But far from the battlefield, a different kind of mission was being prepared. Sir Ernest Shackleton, a seasoned polar explorer, set out to do what no man had ever achieved: cross the entire continent of Antarctica from sea to sea on foot. It was called the Imperial Transantarctic Expedition, and it would become one of the most famous tales of survival in history. Not because Shackleton succeeded, but because of how he failed, and how he refused to let that failure cost a single life. The dream of conquest. Shackleton's ship, the Endurance, sailed from England with 27 men aboard. They were soldiers, sailors, carpenters, and scientists drawn not by money, but by adventure. Shackleton's recruitment ad, though perhaps apocryphal, said it all. Men wanted for hazardous journey. Small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful. Yet still, men lined up to join. The plan was daring. Land on one side of Antarctica, march across the frozen continent, merge on the other side, proving man's dominion over the last unconquered wilderness. But Antarctica had other plans. The trap. In January 1915, the Endurance entered the Weddell Sea, aiming for the Antarctic coast. But suddenly, the pack ice closed in. Sheets of frozen ocean pressed against the ship, locking it in place. The crew hacked and shoveled, praying for a thaw. But the ice only tightened. Day after day, week after week, the ship sat trapped, drifting with the frozen sea. By February, Shackleton realized the truth. The Endurance would never reach land. For months, the men lived aboard, trapped in a floating prison. They hunted seals and penguins for food, kept journals, and tried to keep morale high. Shackleton visited every tent daily, cracking jokes, sharing rations, making sure despair didn't take root. But by October 1915, the ice began to move again, in release, but in destruction. Massive pressure ridges rose, groaning. The ship's hull buckled, beams snapping like matchsticks. The Endurance was being crushed alive. Shackleton gave the order: abandon ship. The march on the ice, with only lifeboats, sledges, and supplies. The men camped on the ice. Around them stretched hundreds of miles of frozen wasteland, no trees, no landmarks, only white in every direction. They tried to march across the floes, dragging the lifeboats behind them. But the ice shifted constantly, breaking, reforming, carrying them backward. Exhausted and half-starved, they realized they could not walk out. So they camped, waiting for the ice to drift them north toward open sea. Shackleton called it a gamble against nature. The lifeboat gamble. By April 1916, the ice beneath them was breaking up. There was no choice. Take to the lifeboats. For days, the men rowed through freezing seas, lashed by storms, surrounded by icebergs. Their hands blistered, lips cracked, bodies shaking with cold. Some were ready to give up, but Shackleton never let despair settle. He rowed alongside his men, encouraging, ordering, urging them forward. At last, after 7 terrifying days, they reached Elephant Island, barren, icy rock, far from any shipping routes. They had land beneath their feet, but no hope of rescue. If they stayed, they would die. The impossible voyage. Shackleton made a decision so bold it seemed like madness. He would take one of the lifeboats, the James Caird, and sail across 800 miles of the stormiest ocean on Earth from Elephant Island to South Georgia, where a whaling station offered salvation. 6 men volunteered to go. The rest would stay behind, surviving as best they could in makeshift shelters of overturned boats, waiting for rescue. On April 24, 1916, Shackleton and his crew of 6 set out. Their boat was only 22 feet long, designed for short coastal trips, not the furious waves of the Southern Ocean. For 16 days, they battled the elements' 40-foot waves. Freezing spray, gales that threatened to flip them at any moment. Their clothes were soaked, their skin raw with salt and frost. They navigated by sextant, catching glimpses of the sun through storm clouds, often guessing their course. At times, they nearly capsized. At times, they lost all hope. But Shackleton's presence was like an anchor unyielding, steady, determined. The mountain crossing. Finally, on May 10th, the James Caird reached South Georgia. But fate mocked them. They had landed on the wrong side. Between them and the whaling station lay an impassable mountain range, jagged peaks. Glaciers and cliffs no man had ever crossed. But Shackleton did not hesitate. With 2 men at his side, he set out across the mountains with nothing more than rope and nails hammered into their boots. For 36 hours, they marched without rest, climbing ice cliffs, sliding down glaciers, traversing ridges in darkness. At last, on May 20th, they staggered into the whaling station at Stromness. The men there could hardly believe their eyes. Shackleton was alive. The rescue? But Shackleton's mission was not over. His men were still stranded on Elephant Island. 3 times ice-blocked rescue attempts. But Shackleton refused to give up. Finally, on August 30th, 1916, more than a year and a half after the Endurance had been trapped, he reached the island. The men, gaunt and bearded, rushed to the shore. Shackleton called out the question he had carried in his heart for months. "Are you all well?" The reply came, "All safe, all well." Not a single man had been lost. The legacy: Shackleton never reached his goal of crossing Antarctica. But he achieved something greater. He proved that leadership, courage, and loyalty could triumph over even the most merciless environment. His men revered him, not as a conqueror of the land, but as a protector of life. In the years since, countless soldiers, explorers, and leaders have studied Shackleton's methods of morale, endurance, and unbreakable will. Closing reflection. The ice tried to crush him. The sea tried to drown him. The mountains tried to stop him. Yet Shackleton never let despair take hold, not in himself, not in his men. The Endurance may have sunk, but its name lives on. For Shackleton's expedition became the very definition of endurance. In the end, he gave the world one of the greatest survival stories ever told, not of conquest, but of hope. Chapter 10. Stephen Callahan, 76 Days. Adrift. The ocean is a place of beauty, but for those who are stranded upon it, it becomes a prison without walls, a slow executioner. In 1982, a man named Stephen Callahan learned this truth the hardest way possible. For 76 days, he drifted alone across the Atlantic in a tiny, inflatable raft, starving, dehydrated, and constantly stalked by sharks. His story is not just one of survival, but of raw determination and human ingenuity when stripped to the very edge. The voyage begins. Stephen Callahan was 29 years old, an American sailor and designer who loved the sea. He had built his own sailboat, Napoleon Solo, and decided to cross the Atlantic alone from Spain to the Caribbean. Many thought it was madness. Callahan thought it was freedom. In early February 1982, he set out from the Canary Islands. The ocean stretched before him, vast and empty, but he was confident. He had sailed before. He knew the risks. What he didn't know was how quickly everything could go wrong. Disaster in the night. On the 6th night of his voyage, a storm struck. The waves rose higher, the winds howled like wolves. Callahan fought to control his boat, but in the darkness, something catastrophic happened. To this day, he is uncertain whether it was a whale, debris, or the storm itself, but the hull of his boat was suddenly punctured. Water gushed in within minutes. Napoleon Solo was sinking. Callahan scrambled for his inflatable life raft and survival bag. In the chaos, he managed to grab only a few essentials: some food, a fishing spear, a sleeping bag, and a solar Stilla device to turn seawater into drinking water. Then he climbed into the raft and watched as his beloved sailboat vanished beneath the waves. He was alone, adrift hundreds of miles from land. The raft was only 6 feet long, a floating rubber cocoon barely larger than a bathtub. It had no motor, no sail, no way to steer. Just an orange speck on an endless blue desert. Callahan's first days were spent trying to organize what little he had. He rationed his supplies: a few cans of food, some rainwater, a spear gun. He knew the Atlantic would not be kind. Hunger and ingenuity. His food lasted less than a week. Hunger clawed at him, forcing him to adapt. Callahan turned the ocean into his hunting ground. With his spear, he learned to catch mahi-mahi and flying fish. At first, they outsmarted him, darting away just as he struck. But gradually, his skills sharpened. When he succeeded, he ate the fish raw, drinking their blood for liquid. The raft became a floating butcher shop, stained with scales and guts. Sharks often circled, attracted by the scent. At night, they bumped the raft, testing it, their fins cutting the surface like knives. But Callahan refused to give up. He fashioned fishing lures from scraps, repaired tears in his raft with duct tape and glue, and used the solar still to drip precious drops of fresh water, just enough to stay alive. The torment of thirst. If hunger was painful, thirst was worse. The sun blazed relentlessly, baking his skin, cracking his lips, draining every drop of sweat. At times, clouds teased him with the promise of rain, only to pass by. He began to dream of water, constantly cool streams, icy drinks, even puddles. His solar stills often malfunctioned, producing barely enough to keep him conscious. He learned to treasure every drop, cradling it like gold. The passing ships, like Punlim, decades before him. Callahan's greatest torment was hope. Twice, ships passed near enough that he could see them. He fired flares, waved, screamed. But no one saw the tiny raft. No one stopped. Each time, despair threatened to consume him. But Callahan was stubborn. "I will not die out here," he told himself. The slow march of days. Days turned into weeks. Weeks blurred into months. Callahan kept a log in his journal, marking the passage of time, sketching fish he caught, recording his thoughts. His body wasted away. He lost a third of his weight, his beard wild, his skin blistered. But he never stopped fighting. He repaired his raft dozens of times, sewing and patching as it deflated under the sun. He kept fishing, even when sharks threatened. He kept drinking, even when the water tasted foul. He kept breathing, even when loneliness screamed louder than hunger. The rescue. On his 76th day adrift, Callahan spotted seagulls circling. It was a sign of land. His heart pounded. Soon after, he saw fishermen in small boats near the Caribbean island of Marigalante, near Guadeloupe. Weak and delirious, he waved frantically. The fishermen spotted him, rowed over, and pulled the half-dead man into their boat. His ordeal was over. The aftermath. Stephen Callahan had drifted over 1,800 miles across the Atlantic. He had survived shark attacks, dehydration, starvation, and despair. When he returned home, doctors marveled that he was alive at all. His story became world famous. He wrote a book, Adrift, 76 Days Lost at Sea, which became a bestseller. Hollywood even drew inspiration from his tale for movies like Life of Pi. But for Callahan, the greatest victory wasn't fame. It was simply the fact that he had lived. He had stared into the face of the ocean, the same ocean that has claimed countless lives and refused to let it swallow him. Closing reflection. Survival is rarely about strength. It is about endurance, willpower, and the refusal to let go. Stephen Callahan was not a soldier, not a superhuman, not armed with advanced technology. He was just a man in a rubber raft, armed only with creativity and determination. For 76 days, the Atlantic tried to break him. But like Shackleton, like Poonlin, he endured. And his story reminds us of a simple, terrifying, beautiful truth. Even in the loneliest corner of the world, the human spirit can keep a man alive.